Welcome. Welcome to Bielefeld Sunrise Church on this Sunday, January 12th, our Sunday service in the new year. This year, I introduce our new Glad You Asked sermon series, in which we preach on topics you indicated you wanted to hear more about. The inclusion of the LGBTQ plus community ranked amongst the most frequently requested topics. So today I will start my journey I will share the journey which is my own and that of others, the journey of discovery about the Bible and how I understand that God works, in hopes that it may give you some things to think about and resources that may help you with your conversations. We start with a pastor from the American Midwest, and this pastor tells us about his personal story of actually misusing the Bible. His story is that he grew up in the Midwest, as I mentioned, without knowing anyone in the LGBTQ plus community, or so he thought. As an evangelical in high school, the future pastor sensed a call to ministry early. He learned that the Bible said homosexuality is a sin. So in 1983, when his little brother came out, he was flabbergasted, angry, cruel. "You are an abomination going to hell," he pronounced, and wouldn't have anything to do with him until the brother got over what he assumed was another of his phases. There's him studying to be a minister, acting judgy and hateful. There was his brother, writing off Christianity based on his reaction. Guess what he did? He behaved more Christian than the pastor and forgave him. His whole perspective shifted. He listened to his brother's story and his desperate attempts to change. He didn't want to throw away the relationship with his only sibling. At first, he tried, quote, hating the sin and loving the sinner, a quote many of you know just too well. But he thinks whenever we introduce hate into the equation, inevitably it splashes out of its container and burns someone worse than acid. He then thought, if I can love and accept that this is who Ricky is, his brother is, surely God can too. So he focused on the other parts of the Bible about not judging, accepting all, treating everyone with love. He eventually found refuge in Psalm 139 that says, each of us is wonderfully created in God's image. What does the Bible say about homosexuality? He vowed to his brother that he would accept and affirm the LGBTQ plus community, foundational in their ministry. But to do that, he needed to understand better what the Bible said about the subject. Now, here's my take. In seminary, theologians learn Greek and Hebrew, contexts in which authors composed each part of the Bible. Students learn about how surrounding cultures influence biblical authors. Over the years, I've read countless books and scholarly articles from all perspectives on the relevant passages. What follows is a summary of what I've discovered and I have come to believe. The shocking truth is the Bible has very little to say about same-sex relationships. And what it says is ambiguous and almost always taken out of context. Did you know that there are only 6 verses that actually verbally mention it? It is never in a section talked about on its own. It gets included in general lists of things people of the time assumed were wrong. What did Jesus say about homosexuality? Jesus had zero to say on the subject. 6 verses. There are 50 verses about not lending money, 2,000 plus about treating the poor and immigrants better. 133 verses condemn gossip, yet we make all this fuss over 6 verses out of 31,102 biblical verses altogether. Several times, especially in Matthew 23, Jesus criticized religious leaders of his day for picking out the most minor commandments to judge others, while ignoring the weightier matters of faith, such as justice, mercy, and faith. Only 0.001% of all of the verses in the Bible are related to our subject here today. But huge chunks of texts echo what Jesus said is most important, quote, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Shouldn't we follow Jesus and keep our focus on the love stuff and not get distracted by the more minor and less important topics? Now, clobber passages, as they're called, against LGBTQ plus individuals. A mother once questions why I used the Bible in youth group. As a lesbian, her alarm bells went off because people had beaten her over the head with the Bible. Tragically, many have abandoned the Bible and faith because of these 6 verses, often called the clobber passages, quote unquote, because of how they are used to hurt people. The first thing to notice is these passages weren't talking about loving same-gendered relationships based on equality. That's a notion foreign to the biblical period, so we need to see exactly what they were describing. Sodom and Gomorrah is about hospitality, not sexuality. First, in Genesis 19, we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. 2 strangers visit a town and find hospitality with a man named Lot. All the males in town, from the youngest to the oldest, go to Lot's house and demand that Lot sends out the strangers so that they might have sex with them. This is not about loving relationships. It's about ancient cultural practices to dominate and abuse outsiders. It's to send a warning message to their home country. Don't mess with us. Genesis 19 describes not a loving relationship, but a gang assault. Furthermore, we know it wasn't about sexual orientation because all the males were present. Surely they weren't all gay. The Bible itself tells us that the point of the story isn't about homosexuality. God reflects on the scene in Ezekiel 16, verse 49, identifying the problem as the city being, quote, arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and needy, unquote. In Matthew 10, Jesus associated Sodom and Gomorrah as being about lack of hospitality, not sex. Even conservative modern commentators admit that this passage is not about same-gendered relationships. If you want to apply this passage to the conversation, then realize that the church has used it for centuries as a justification to be inhospitable to the queer community. It is the church that stands condemned by this passage, not the queer community. What if we decided, let's take the story seriously and figure out how we can offer extraordinary hospitality to the LGBTQ plus community and all who have felt excluded by the church? Now, we'll now look at Leviticus passages which were mistranslated. There are only 2 Old Testament verses found in Leviticus 18:23 and 20:13. Leviticus contains long lists of rules intended initially as guidelines for priests of the tribe of Levi, not a universal application to everyone. Leviticus gives the context of these passages by saying that now that the people had crossed into the promised land, here are the ways of distinguishing yourselves from the Egyptians and Canaanites who surrounded you. They felt God called the Hebrews to be culturally distinct. We find lists of distinctions based on your clothing, the food you ate, your family configuration, and a substantial amount of stuff about what you do with your ox. These guidelines weren't talking about what is eternally sinful, but about shaping a culture distinct from their surrounding neighbors. So that is the context. The passage calls a man lying with a man an abomination, quote unquote. But abomination, in the way that we think of it, is not a fair translation. No one translated it that way until the late 1500s. We think abomination is sinful, monstrous, evil. The Hebrew word is not an abomination, but tuva. Throughout the Old Testament is used in a way that does not imply a sinful nature. Genesis, for example, says Egyptians considered shepherds tuva. In Leviticus, it is tuva if your ox tramples your corn. The passage says nothing about orientation or anything about lesbian sex. Scholars think that some specific type of activity was being denounced, but it's ambiguous because of how the sentences are phrased. There is a missing preposition that we can only guess at what it is. If you want to say you take the Bible literally, then do it from a direct transportation of the original language. And I don't only say this today, I say this all the time. Here is the literal translation. And with mankind, not you will lie, lyings of, unquote, a woman. Susan Piggott suggests, quote, and with a male, you will not lay on the couches or beds of a woman, unquote. It doesn't even make any sense, let alone be something you can clobber somebody with. We don't take the other prohibitions seriously today. Also, these references in Leviticus get cherry-picked from a list of other prohibitions we don't apply today. The list also prohibits you to eat shellfish, get tattoos, gossip, wear clothes made of 2 different kinds of fabric, trim your beard, cut your hair, walk by a person in need. According to Leviticus, the worst thing is failing to observe the Sabbath, not with whom you sleep. Romans 1-2 is about rejecting judgmentalism. The New Testament makes clear that in Christ we are not bound to them. That's why we don't keep kosher, why we can celebrate the Sabbath on a different day, etc. It's not about adherence to the law, but faith. That is what Paul argues in the book of Romans. But Romans also contains the 4th clobber passage, Romans 1, verses 26-27. Again, it is in a list of things considered vices. The writing style and context of the passage suggests that Paul quotes a well-known list of the times. He's taking on the voice of someone else with whom he disagrees for the sake of making a more significant point. It's similar to how Jesus said, "You have heard it said, but I say to you." This is a device Jesus used to say that the old laws and ways of doing things are no longer valid. In Romans, Paul is trying to unite a community divided between Jewish and non-Jewish identities. He used a typical list of Jewish complaints about the pagan, overindulgent Gentile ways of living. Because he focuses on idolatry immediately before he writes about acts between men, he is likely referring to group sex rituals that were part of pagan worship ceremonies and not committed loving same-sex relationships. Nevertheless, the point of bringing up the list was to get the Jewish faction to say, yeah, Those Gentiles are horrible. Then Paul springs the trap in the very next breath, chapter 2, by saying the Jewish judginess of the Gentiles is proof that everyone is in the same boat. No one is better than anyone else. So let's stop judging and condemning and come together if we want to take the heart of Romans 1 and 2 seriously. We would stop judging and find ways to reconcile. The concept of homosexuality as an orientation is foreign to Bible writers. The last two New Testament passages are 1 Corinthians 9 and 1 Timothy 1, verse 10. Some translations go as far as using the word homosexual in them, but that is anachronistic, and most of it stems back to the last century. Yeah, you heard me right. This is not about like 2,000 years old, but not even 100. The concept of homosexuality as an orientation didn't exist in Bible days. There was no Greek word that talks about the same thing that we think of today. According to the scholarship, the passages are talking about the common practice in Roman culture of married men taking on impoverished, can't talk anymore. So there were married men in Roman times who were taking on impoverished younger men as on the side lovers. The matter isn't about orientation as much as it is about exploitation. The passages establish a universal, healthy sex ethic, loving and mutual, not predatory nor compulsory. What Bible authors might say today. So that's it. That is all there is in the Bible on the subject. It's ambiguous at best and never talking about the same thing we talk about in terms of committed, loving relationships, period, as in period. If you traveled back in time and asked the authors of if relationships in the same gender are wrong, their knee-jerk reaction would be to say, of course. But after you explained orientation and what has happened to people because of their words, they would be horrified and take it all back. How could they have guessed all of the acts of violence, homicides, cruelty, shaming, families breaking apart that their words would provoke? Or imagine how many people would hate themselves, or how many young people would commit suicide because someone called them an abomination rather than a beloved child of God. If they could see all of this, they would take it back in a heartbeat. They knew that Jesus said, don't be the cause for someone to stumble in their faith, and that we should love others as Jesus loved us unconditionally. The Bible is about inclusion, not exclusion. In the end, the Bible has a whole lot more to say about inclusion than exclusion. For example, Pentecost was about the establishment of a church that overcame differences. A significant portion of the New Testament is devoted to overcoming differences between Gentiles and Jews. In Acts 10, they decide that the same laws about diet in Leviticus no longer apply. To maintain my voice, I treated myself to some tea. So these same rules, same laws about, say, diet that was in the book of Leviticus no longer apply. It's not those laws that count, it's faith, because Jesus came to set us free from the law. Paul overcomes all divisions in Galatians 3. Quote, there is no longer Greek and Jew, slave and free, male and female, for you are all one in Jesus Christ, unquote. If we applied the lessons from these passages, there is no way we would wind up in an exclusionary system. Read it properly, and you will see the whole gender debate is also included and answered. The Ethiopian eunuch. I should also mention that in Acts 8, we find that an Ethiopian eunuch was one of the first people baptized into the church. Most of you know the story. Eunuchs included a much wider field than those castrated. It also included people not attracted to the opposite sex. In Matthew 19, Jesus said, "Some are eunuchs from birth." Jesus was all about inclusion, especially to people marginalized by the rest of society. Because of the laws in Leviticus, the Ethiopian eunuch was not allowed to enter the Jerusalem temple. But they set all that aside to baptize him despite the Old Testament law. Being an open and affirming generation is what we strive for, and that's why we are a church where, as long as I'm here, you will never hear exclusivist, judgmental, condemning language from this pulpit. When I began, I promised that my ministry would be about inclusion and doing everything I could to make the church a safe place for everyone. Many churches merely tolerate quote unquote LGBTQ plus people in their congregations, but still view them as abominations. Let us instead be not just open, but affirming that every person is created in the image of God and, as our psalm says, fearfully and wonderfully made. May there never be another suicide or act of hatred because people think the Bible says God hates people as they are. We know better. So let us see the good in everyone, affirm them, and encourage everyone to develop God's gifts to make a positive difference in the world. To do otherwise would be an abomination.